Have you ever sat at your own child's wedding, dressed in your best, heart full of pride, and realized that the people across the table were looking at you like you didn't belong there? This is the story of Margaret. And the night that question got answered in the worst possible way. Margaret was 68 years old. A woman who had built her life with her own hands, raised her son David alone after her husband passed, worked double shifts, skipped the things she wanted so he could have the things he needed. She wasn't a woman who asked for much. She didn't need to be celebrated. She didn't need to be thanked every day. She just needed to know that the son she had poured her entire life into still saw her. For most of his life, he did. David called every Sunday. Showed up with flowers on her birthday. When he got his first big promotion, she was the first person he called. Not his friends. Not anyone else. His mother. "We did it, Mama," he had said. Voice cracking like he was still that 14-year-old boy who had just lost his father. "You did it," she told him. "I just stayed close." That was her David. Then he met Vanessa. Vanessa was polished. Beautiful. The kind of woman who always said the right thing at the right time and made it look effortless. The first time David brought her home, she complimented Margaret's house, asked about her garden, laughed warmly at every story. Margaret smiled and poured the sweet tea. But that night, sitting alone in her kitchen after they left, Margaret felt something she couldn't quite name. Not jealousy. Not dislike. Something older than that. Something that lived in the gut of a woman who had seen enough of life to know, some smiles are worn like a coat. Put on at the door. Taken off at home. She said nothing. David was a grown man. It wasn't her place. Maybe she was wrong. She prayed she was wrong. She wasn't. David and Vanessa wedding was held on a Saturday in June. Margaret wore her best dress, deep burgundy, the one she had saved for. She had her hair done the day before. She sat in the front pew with her hands folded in her lap and watched her son marry a woman she was still trying to love. When David said his vows, she cried. Of course she did. Because whatever her doubts were, this was still her boy. Her only boy. The reception was held at a hotel downtown. Round tables with white linens. A live band. More people than Margaret knew. Vanessa's family had come in from out of town, her mother Patricia, her brother Glenn, 2 aunts, a handful of cousins. They were loud, confident, and took up space the way people do when they have never once doubted they belonged somewhere. Margaret was introduced around the table. Handshakes. Smiles. She settled into her seat, smoothed her dress, and told herself, just get through the evening. Be gracious. Be dignified. Be the woman you raised yourself to be. The food came. The band played. Toasts were made. And then Glenn, Vanessa's brother, a large man with a loud voice and an even louder laugh, leaned across the table and pointed at Margaret with a wide grin, the way men do when they think they're being charming. Margaret, I'll be honest with you, he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Margaret looked up. Vanessa was so worried before this wedding. Kept saying, what will my guests think when they meet David's mother? He threw his hands up, still grinning. But hey, you scrubbed up all right. He laughed. A big, rolling laugh. Patricia, Vanessa's mother, covered her mouth and giggled. 2 of the cousins exchanged a look and smiled. And Vanessa, the bride, Margaret's new daughter-in-law, the woman David had chosen above all others, looked down at her plate with the smallest, quietest smile at the corner of her mouth. She did not correct her brother. She did not say a word. The whole thing lasted. Maybe 10 seconds. But for Margaret, those 10 seconds opened up like a wound. Because Glenn had just said, in front of everyone, dressed up as a joke, that Vanessa had been ashamed of her. That Margaret, with her life and her sacrifices and her dignity, was something to be worried about. Something to apologize for. Something that needed to scrub up before she was fit to be seen. Margaret felt the heat rise to her face. And then, slowly, with everything she had, she turned to look at her son. David was sitting right beside her. He had heard every word. He reached for his wine glass and took a long, slow sip. He did not look at Glenn. He did not look at Vanessa. He did not look at his mother. He just looked away. And Margaret, 68 years old, best dress, hair done the day before, sat up straight in her chair. She turned back to the table. She smiled. Graciously. Calmly. The smile of a woman who has survived far harder things than a table full of people who don't know her worth. She picked up her fork. And deep inside, in a place she had never had to visit before, something very quietly closed. That was the first time. She told herself it was just one moment. Just one careless man at a wedding. But a mother's heart keeps score even when her mouth stays silent. After the wedding, Margaret told herself the same thing she had told herself her whole life when something hurt. Move forward. Stay dignified. Don't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. So she moved forward. She welcomed Vanessa into the family the only way she knew how, through her hands. She cooked. She showed up. She invited them to Sunday dinner, remembered Vanessa's preferences, never came empty-handed. She was determined to make this work. But here is the thing about people who have already decided they are above you. Your effort doesn't impress them. It entertains them. The more Margaret gave, the more Vanessa and her family took it as confirmation that Margaret needed them. That she was beneath them. That the gap between their world and hers was real, and permanent, and amusing. It was Thanksgiving, 5 months after the wedding. Margaret had spent 2 days cooking. Turkey, dressing, candied yams, greens, cornbread, sweet potato pie. The kind of meal that takes a woman's entire heart to prepare. She carried it all to David and Vanessa's house in foil-covered dishes, navigating the front steps carefully so nothing would spill. Vanessa's mother Patricia was already there when Margaret arrived. So was Glenn. So were the aunts. The house smelled like Vanessa's catered food ordered from a restaurant downtown, already laid out beautifully on the dining table. Margaret set her dishes in the kitchen. Quietly. Without comment. At the table, Patricia looked at Margaret's sweet potato pie, the same recipe Margaret's own mother had taught her, and said with a pleasant smile, "Oh, how sweet. Did you get this from a box, Margaret? It has that homemade look." She said homemade the way some people say second-hand. Glenn snorted. One of the aunts pressed her lips together to hide a smile. And Vanessa, sitting at the head of the table in her own home, said nothing. Just reached over and refilled her wine glass. Margaret looked at David. David was cutting his turkey. Eyes down. Jaw tight. He had heard it. He kept cutting. Margaret looked back at Patricia and said, "From scratch, actually. My mother's recipe. 60 years old." Patricia raised her eyebrows politely. "How lovely," she said, and turned away to talk to Glenn. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap under the table. She had cooked for 2 days. 2 days of her life, her energy, her love, laid out on that table. And it had just been dismissed in 8 words by a woman who had never once struggled for anything. She breathed. She steadied herself. She looked one more time at David. He was laughing now at something Glenn had said. She had cooked for 2 days. He laughed in 2 seconds. And something in Margaret's chest shifted, just slightly. Like a picture frame knocked crooked on a wall. Not fallen. Not broken. Just, no longer straight. By Christmas, Margaret had learned to read the room before she walked into it. She could tell within 60 seconds of arriving at David and Vanessa's house whether it was going to be a good visit or a long one. She learned which topics to avoid. She learned that Vanessa's family had a way of speaking about their vacations, their neighborhood, their children's private schools, not to share, but to remind. To remind Margaret of the distance between her life and theirs. She learned to smile through it. But Christmas that year brought something new. The family had gathered for gift exchanging after dinner. Margaret had bought thoughtful gifts for everyone, including Vanessa, including Patricia, including Glenn. She had budgeted carefully. She had wrapped everything herself. When it was Margaret's turn to open her gift from Vanessa and David, she unwrapped it slowly. It was a cookbook. Not just any cookbook. One of those beginner cookbooks. The kind with large print and simple instructions. The kind you buy for someone who has never learned to cook properly. Margaret turned it over in her hands. Vanessa leaned forward from across the room and said brightly, "I thought it might help you update some of your recipes, Margaret. Give them a more modern touch. David says you've been cooking the same things for 30 years. She smiled. Warm. Innocent. Glenn laughed. Upgrade the kitchen, upgrade the menu, right, Margaret? Patricia nodded approvingly at her daughter. The room moved on. Someone else opened a gift. The moment passed like it was nothing. But Margaret sat holding that cookbook, that beginner cookbook with its large print and its simple instructions, and understood exactly what had just happened. She had not been given a gift. She had been given a message. You are old. You are behind. What you know, what you built, what you cooked with your own hands for decades, it is not good enough for this family. She turned to David. He was looking at his phone. Margaret set the cookbook down on the cushion beside her. She folded her hands in her lap. She smiled at Vanessa and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. How thoughtful." And she meant none of it. Not a single word. Because for the first time in her 68 years, Margaret was done being thankful for things that were meant to diminish her. She just didn't know it yet. There is a particular kind of humiliation that comes wrapped in a bow and handed to you with a smile. And the cruelest part, you are expected to say thank you. It kept happening. At every dinner. Every holiday. Every family gathering where Vanessa's world and Margaret's world were forced to sit at the same table. A comment about her clothes. A joke about her neighborhood. A question about whether she had ever traveled anywhere, asked in a tone that already assumed the answer was no. Always delivered with a smile. Always wrapped in enough politeness to make Margaret look oversensitive if she reacted. And every single time, without fail, Margaret would look at David. Her son. The boy she had raised. The man she had sacrificed for. The person on this earth who knew her best and loved her longest. And every single time, David would be looking somewhere else. At his plate. At his phone. At the wall. At Vanessa. Anywhere but at his mother. She wasn't asking him to fight. She had never been a woman who needed someone to fight her battles. She just needed him to see her. To look up. To catch her eye. To give her even the smallest signal that said, "I know. I see it. You are not invisible to me." But that signal never came. And slowly, so slowly that Margaret herself did not notice it happening, she stopped expecting it. She stopped looking at him when it happened. Because looking had started to hurt more than the insult itself. When a mother stops looking to her son for comfort, that is not a small thing. That is the beginning of a goodbye she hasn't said out loud yet. She wasn't losing her son to another woman. She was losing him to his own silence. And silence, when it happens again and again, eventually sounds exactly like a choice. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. Margaret was not a weak woman. She had buried a husband. She had raised a son alone. She had built a life from nothing with her bare hands and never once asked the world to feel sorry for her. She had smiled through the wedding insult. She had held her head up at Thanksgiving. She had said thank you for a gift that was designed to humiliate her. She had done all of that because she believed, she genuinely believed, that her son would eventually see what was happening. That one day he would look up from his plate, from his phone, from whatever comfortable distance he kept between himself and her pain, and he would say something. She was still waiting for that day. And then came the dinner party. Every woman has a moment she can point to. The exact moment she stopped making excuses for someone she loved. For Margaret, this was that moment. It was a Saturday evening in March, almost 2 years after the wedding. Vanessa and David were hosting a dinner party. 10 people around the table, Vanessa's colleagues from work, Glenn and Patricia, and Margaret, who had been invited at the last minute. She found out later it was David who had insisted she be included. She had dressed carefully. She arrived on time. She brought a bottle of wine she couldn't really afford because she didn't want to arrive empty-handed. The evening started pleasantly enough. The food was good. The conversation moved around the table the way it does at dinner parties, loud and overlapping and easy. Margaret sat near the end of the table. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed when things were funny. She was, as she had always been, gracious, present, dignified. And then Vanessa's colleague, a sharp-faced woman named Diane who had been drinking since she arrived, pointed at Margaret from across the table and said loudly, "So who is this? David's mother?" Vanessa smiled. "That's right." Diane tilted her head, studying Margaret openly the way people do when they've had too much wine and lost the filter between their thoughts and their mouth. She said. "David never talks about you at the office. We didn't even know he had a mother still around." A beat of uncomfortable silence. And then Glenn, always Glenn, leaned back in his chair with that wide grin of his and said, "Oh Diane, trust me. She's always around. Whether she's wanted or not." The table erupted. Real laughter. Not polite laughter. The kind that fills a room. Patricia dabbed her eye. Vanessa pressed her hand to her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Margaret felt it go through her like ice water. "Whether she's wanted or not." Said out loud. In front of strangers. In her son's home. She sat very still. And then she did what she always did. She turned to look at David. David was at the head of the table. He had heard it. She could see from the slight stiffening of his shoulders that he had heard every word. He looked at Margaret. For one single second, they looked at each other. And in that second Margaret saw something she had never seen before in her son's eyes. Not anger on her behalf. Not shame at what had just been said. Discomfort. The discomfort of a man who did not want a scene. Who wanted the laughter to die down and the evening to move on and for his mother to do what she always did, smile, absorb it, and let it go. He looked at her with eyes that said, "Please. Not here. Not tonight." And then he turned to Glenn and said, "So Glenn, how's the new job going?" And just like that, the table moved on. Margaret sat at that table. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of people who had not earned her tears. She did not stand up and leave. She was not a woman who made scenes. She sat there. Hands folded in her lap. Back straight. And for the first time in 2 years, she did not smile. She simply sat with her face still and her eye clear and let the moment be exactly what it was. Because something had just happened that could not be undone. David had not just stayed silent this time. This time, he had looked her in the eye. He had seen her sitting there, humiliated in front of strangers in his own home. He had made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice, and he had changed the subject. He had chosen the comfort of the table over the dignity of his mother. And Margaret, 68 years old, hands folded in her lap, back straight as it had always been, finally understood something she had been refusing to understand for 2 years. He was not going to save her. He had never been going to save her. Not because he didn't love her. But because he loved his peace more. She had spent 2 years waiting for her son to choose her. That night she finally accepted, he already had. He just hadn't chosen her. She left at 9 o'clock. She thanked Vanessa for dinner. She hugged David at the door, and he hugged her back, tight, the way he always did, as if nothing had happened. As if the evening had been perfectly ordinary. "Drive safe, Mama," he said. "Always do," she said. She walked to her car. She got in. She closed the door. And she sat in the dark for a long moment before she turned the key. She thought about the boy who had called her the moment he got his first promotion. She thought about the 14-year-old who had held her hand at his father's funeral and told her, "I'm going to take care of you, Mama. I promise." She thought about every school night, every double shift, every pair of shoes she hadn't bought herself so he could have what he needed. And she thought about the look in his eyes tonight. "Please. Not here. Not tonight." She started the car. She drove home through the quiet streets and she did not turn on the radio because she needed the silence. She needed to sit inside this feeling and understand it fully before she decided what to do with it. By the time she pulled into her driveway on Delaney Street, her house, the one she had bought herself, the one no one could take away, something in her had settled. Not broken. Not bitter. Settled. Like a woman who has finally stopped arguing with the truth. She went inside. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had helped David with his college applications all those years ago, and she made a quiet, private decision. No more showing up where she was tolerated. No more smiling through things that were not funny. No more looking at her son and waiting for something he was never going to give her. She was 68 years old. She had sacrificed enough. She had waited long enough. From this night forward, she would pour her love into people who could hold it properly. Starting with herself. The smile was gone. And in its place, something far more powerful. A woman who had finally decided her own peace was worth more than anyone's comfort. Vanessa noticed it on a Tuesday evening. She was in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of wine when she realized Margaret hadn't called that weekend. No Sunday check-in. No voicemail asking about David's schedule. No invitation to come over for dinner that Vanessa would have to politely decline. Nothing. She stood there with her wine glass and thought about it. Ran back through the past few weeks in her mind. Margaret had turned down the last 2 Sunday dinners. She had sent a gift for Vanessa's birthday instead of coming in person. She had called David on his birthday, briefly, lovingly, and not mentioned once that she hadn't seen him in almost a month. Vanessa set her wine glass down. And she smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the smile she wore at dinner tables and family gatherings. A real one. Private. Satisfied. The smile of a woman who has been quietly pushing against a door for 2 years, and has just felt it finally give way. She picked up her wine glass and walked back to the living room where David was watching television. "Your mother seems to be giving us more space lately," she said, settling onto the couch beside him. "It's nice, don't you think?" David looked up. "She's just busy." "Of course," Vanessa said warmly. And turned to the television. But the smile didn't leave her face for the rest of the evening. She had one. That is what Vanessa believed. She had no idea that the woman she thought she had finally pushed out had simply decided to walk out on her own terms. And those are 2 very different things. Vanessa thought Margaret was retreating. She didn't understand yet, a woman who retreats is running away from something. A woman like Margaret was walking toward something. And there is all the difference in the world between the 2. She stopped being the one who always called first. She stopped reorganizing her entire week around whether she had heard from David. She stopped sitting by the phone on Sunday afternoon. The way she had been doing without even fully realizing it, for 2 years. She stopped accepting invitations to a house where she had to put on armor before she sat down at the table. She stopped cooking for 2 days to bring food to people who received it with a smile and a quiet insult. She stopped buying gifts she couldn't afford for a family that had never once made her feel like she belonged. And she stopped, completely and permanently stopped, looking at her son during moments of pain and waiting for him to save her. That vigil was over. She had blown it out like a candle. and the room, to her quiet surprise, did not go dark. It simply got still. She didn't make a speech. She didn't write a letter. She didn't sit David down and explain what she had decided. She simply stopped giving her energy to people who had shown her, again and again, that they did not know how to hold it carefully. She called her old friend Gloria and said, "I have been neglecting you. Let's have lunch." They had lunch. The following week they had lunch again. And the week after that. And they laughed, really laughed, in the way that only old friends can, the kind of laughter that knows your whole history and loves you for all of it. She went back to her church choir. She had quietly stepped away from it 2 years ago, telling herself she was too busy. The truth was she had been spending every spare piece of herself trying to build a bridge to a family that had no interest in meeting her halfway. She walked back into that choir on a Sunday morning and opened her mouth and sang, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was tight. She signed up for a gardening class at the community center. She came home with soil under her fingernails and seeds she had chosen herself. She spent whole Saturday afternoons on her knees in the garden, making things grow, watching them respond to her care, and felt a satisfaction so simple and so complete it almost made her laugh. She started sleeping better. She started laughing more easily. Her shoulders, which she hadn't even realized she'd been holding up around her ears for 2 solid years, slowly, gradually, came down. One morning about 6 weeks after the dinner party, she looked in her mirror and saw something that stopped her. She looked like herself. Not the woman who had been walking into rooms with a smile fixed in place like a shield. Not the woman who checked her son's face every time someone said something cruel to see if this would finally be the time he spoke up. Herself. Margaret. The woman who had built this life with her own hands and had somehow, somewhere along the way, forgotten that it was worth being proud of. She had spent 2 years trying to earn a seat at someone else's table. The moment she stopped, she remembered she had her own table. And it had always been warm. David felt it before he understood it. A Sunday that felt emptier than usual. A week that went by without his mother's voice in it. A birthday call that was warm and loving and exactly right, but somehow shorter than he remembered. A voicemail he kept meaning to return and somehow didn't get around to for 3 days. He told himself she was fine. She sounded fine. She said she was fine. But there was something underneath her voice that he couldn't identify, and couldn't stop thinking about. Not sadness. Not anger. Distance. The kind that doesn't come from miles. The kind that comes from something shifting inside a person, quietly, permanently, without announcement. He mentioned it to Vanessa one evening. "I feel like something's off with my mother." Vanessa didn't look up from her laptop. "She seemed fine when I spoke to her." "When did you speak to her?" "Last week. She called about Easter." "What did you tell her?" "That we already had plans." David went still. "We don't have plans for Easter." Vanessa looked up. Met his eyes. Held them just long enough. "We do now," she said. And smiled. David looked at his wife. And for the first time, something cold moved through him that he could not explain away. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to his mother's name. He stared at it for a long moment. And then he put the phone face down on the table. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. But something had cracked open. Something that was going to be very hard to close again. David had spent 2 years protecting his peace. He was only now beginning to understand what that peace had actually cost him, and who had been paying the price the whole time. It was a Saturday morning when David finally drove to Delaney Street. No phone call ahead. No reason he could explain to Vanessa or to himself. Just a feeling he had been sitting on for weeks that had finally gotten too heavy to ignore. He knocked on his mother's door. Margaret opened it. She was dressed. She looked well. She smiled at him, warm, genuine, and said, "David. What a nice surprise." "Not I've missed you." Not where have you been? Not do you know it's been 6 weeks? Just, what a nice surprise. Like a woman who had genuinely stopped waiting. Like a woman who had made peace with something he hadn't even admitted to himself yet. He stepped inside. The house was the same. The smell of it would polish and something warm from the kitchen hit him in the chest the way home always does when you have stayed away too long. He sat at the kitchen table. She made him coffee without asking because she had been making him coffee his entire life. And for a while they just talked. About ordinary things. His job. Her garden. Gloria and the choir. She seemed lighter, he realized. Easier inside herself. Happier, genuinely happier than he had seen her in years. And that should have made him feel relieved. Instead it made him feel sick. His mother was happy. And somehow that was the thing that finally broke through, because he understood, sitting at that table, that her happiness had nothing to do with him anymore. He was carrying his cup to the sink when he stopped in front of the wall of photographs in the hallway. He had grown up with those photographs. He knew every one of them. His father. His mother young, laughing at something off camera. David at 5 years old, at 10, at 14 standing stiff in a suit at his father's funeral. His graduation. His first apartment. He looked for his wedding photo. It was there small, toward the edge. Him and Vanessa on the steps of the church. But what stopped him was the photo next to it. It was him and his mother. Taken years ago, long before Vanessa, long before any of this. They were in this very kitchen. She was laughing at something. He had his arm around her shoulders and he was grinning like the world was just exactly right. He stood in that hallway for a long time. He thought about the dinner party. About Glenn's voice carrying across the table whether she's wanted or not. About the laughter. About his mother sitting completely still with her hands in her lap. About himself changing the subject. How do you have to live, David thought, to hang a photo like that on your wall and not say a word? He didn't have an answer. And the not having one was its own kind of answer. Guilt doesn't always arrive as a thunderclap. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, through a hallway, past a photograph, in the space between who you were and who you became. He came back to the kitchen. Sat down. Wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Margaret was at the counter. She could feel it coming, the weight of whatever he had brought through the door with him. She turned and looked at him. "Mama," he said. And then stopped. She waited. "The dinner party," he said. "What Glenn said. I should have," he stopped again. Pressed his lips together. "I know I should have said something." Margaret looked at her son. This man she had raised. This man she had loved for every single day of his 40 years on this earth. She didn't fill the silence for him. She had been filling silences for him for 2 years. Not today. "Why didn't you?" she asked. Quietly. No anger. Just the question. David looked down at his cup. "I didn't want a scene," he said. I wanted the night to go smoothly. I thought if I said something it would make everything worse." "For who?" Margaret said. The question sat between them like a stone. David opened his mouth. Closed it. He didn't answer. Because the answer was sitting right there in the room with them and they both already knew what it was. For himself. It would have made things worse for himself. Margaret nodded slowly. "Just once." "I know, baby," she said softly. "I know." And somehow the gentleness of it hurt him more than anger ever could have. She didn't rage. She didn't weep. She just asked one question, and that one question did what 2 years of silence never could. It made him finally see himself clearly. They sat at that kitchen table for a long time after David's answer didn't come. The coffee went cold. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside a car passed slowly down Delaney Street. And then David looked up at his mother and said the words he should have said 2 years ago. "I'm sorry, Mama." Margaret looked at him. Not with fury. Not with tears. With the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had already done her grieving, alone, quietly, without an audience, and had come out the other side of it whole. "I know you are," she said. "That's not enough, is it?" It wasn't a question. He already knew. "No," she said gently. "It's not. An apology without understanding is just a word." And Margaret had not waited this long to settle for just a word. She stood up. Refilled both their cups even though neither of them needed more coffee. Sat back down. Folded her hands on the table. And she talked. Not loudly. Not bitterly. The way a woman talks when she has rehearsed nothing, when the words are simply true and have been waiting long enough. "The night of the wedding," she said. "When Glenn said what he said. About Vanessa being ashamed to introduce me. Do you remember that?" David nodded. Eyes down. "I looked at you," she said. "I wasn't asking you to make a scene. I wasn't asking you to start a fight at your own wedding. I just needed you to look back at me. To let me know you saw it." David said nothing. "You picked up your wine glass," Margaret said. "And you looked away." The words landed quietly. Like something being set down carefully on a table. "And I told myself it was the wedding." He was nervous. He didn't know what to say. She paused. "Then it happened at Thanksgiving. Then Christmas. Then the dinner party." She looked at her son directly. "Every single time, David. I looked at you. Every single time you looked away." David's jaw tightened. His eyes were wet but he was holding it. "I know," he said. His voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to understand something," Margaret said. "I didn't lose you to Vanessa. I want you to hear that clearly. I did not lose my son to his wife." She leaned forward slightly. "I lost him to his silence." And silence, David, when it happens that many times it stops being an accident. It becomes a choice. David pressed his hand over his mouth. "You chose your comfort," she said. "Not cruelly. Just truthfully. Every time. Over and over again. You chose the smoothness of the evening over your own mother sitting there being torn apart." A tear ran down David's face. He didn't wipe it. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you," Margaret said. "I'm telling you because you came here today. You knocked on that door. And I think part of you came here because you already know all of this and you needed someone to finally say it out loud." David nodded. "Once." Slowly. He was crying properly now, quiet, controlled, the way men cry when they have been holding something for far too long. Margaret reached across the table. She put her hand over his. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you every single day of your life and I will love you every day that remains. That is never going to change." She squeezed his hand. "But I am done being invisible in your life. I am done showing up to be humiliated and then smiling through it so that you can be comfortable. I deserve better than that. And honestly, so do you." She didn't destroy him. She didn't have to. The truth did it gently the way only a mother's truth can. Not to break him. To finally wake him up. David sat at that table for a long time after she finished. He thought about his father. About how Ronald had always said your mother is the strongest person in any room she walks into. Treat her accordingly. He had not treated her accordingly. He had treated her like a problem to manage. Like something to smooth over. Like a background presence in a life that had slowly, quietly moved on without her. And she had sat through all of it. Smile in place. Back straight. Never once making a scene. "What do I do?" he asked. His voice was rough. Margaret looked at him. "That," she said, "is entirely up to you." She stood, carried both cups to the sink, looked out the window at her garden, the seeds she had planted, the things she had chosen to tend and grow when she finally stopped pouring herself into people who weren't growing. But whatever you decide, she said without turning around, decide it because it's right. Not because you feel guilty. Guilt fades. A decision made from guilt won't hold. David stood. He came and stood beside her at the window. They looked at the garden together for a moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders the same way he had in that photograph on the hallway wall. And she let him. I'm going to do better, he said. She didn't say I know you will. She didn't say it's okay. Because it wasn't okay yet. And she was done pretending things were okay when they weren't. She simply leaned into him slightly. And let that be enough for today. He said he would do better. She did not promise to believe it. Because a mother who has been through what Margaret has been through knows words are just the beginning. What comes next is everything. Margaret still lives on Delaney Street. Her garden is the best it has ever been. She has lunch with Gloria every week. She sings in the choir every Sunday and means every single word. She is not waiting for anyone. Not for a phone call. Not for an apology. Not for a son to finally look up from his plate and see her. She already saw herself. And that after everything turned out to be enough. She smiled through 2 years of being torn apart. The day she stopped smiling, she started living. And she has not looked back once. Before you go. Maybe you recognized something in Margaret's story today. A dinner table that never quite felt like yours. A child whose silence became its own kind of answer. A smile you wore for so long it started to feel like your real face. If you did hear this, you are not too old to put it down. You are not too far gone to choose yourself. Margaret was 68 years old when she made that decision at her kitchen table. And it changed everything. If this story moved you, drop a comment below. And if someone in your life needs to hear it, share it with them today. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.